Hi class, it's Dr. DiBiase, and in today's lecture, we are basically going to recap some of the key ideas from the literacy unit as a way to close things out. We'll run through a number of the readings, hone in on a couple of central points that the various authors made during this week, and we'll wrap up by asking some questions that will lead us into some of the discussions that we're going to dive into next week. I'll talk a little bit more about that at the end of the video. So, here we go. What do we know after a week of thinking about, a week of really intense thinking about literacy and a lot of intense reading about literacy? So, at the start of the week, right, I asked us to think about what literacy is, and at a very basic level, we tend to think about it as well. It means you can read and write, but as we've sort of seen in the various readings that we've looked at, that is not really a sufficient definition. So one way to think about it, or that I've been thinking about, is that literacy is this multiplicitous, complex commodity, the value of which is determined by multiple factors, right? And that can include political factors, cultural factors, economic factors, technological factors, and more, right? We can also think of literacy as this set of practices acquired over time, and often with the support of sponsors at both the individual and at the institutional level. And just to, again, refresh our memories to something we talked about really early in the week, right? In the same way that we could talk about writing having two stories, sort of a traditional story where, good writing is good writing and good writers are good writers, and this, and then we offer this sort of counter story that's much more complex, right? That writing is contingent, that is shaped by prior experiences, that, good writing depends on a whole host of factors. So too can we apply a similar model for thinking about literacy, right? So in what we might call the autonomous model, literacy is situated in the individual. It's something that you possess, and success and failure is individual. In an ideological model, literacies are situated in a much broader social context, right? And we'll get into that as we sort of move along, right? But that what it means to be literate, what it means to be successful with literacy, can really depend on a number of things outside of the individual, right? The individual is part of the equation, but they're not the whole equation. So when we talk about literacy and multiplicity and complexity, first we think about the fact that there is more than one kind of literacy, right? And that being literate in one context doesn't mean that you're going to be literate in another context. And a number of you brought up certain elements of that, right? Like, we might consider, a 5-year-old to be literate in certain ways, right? Because they can do certain kinds of tasks. But by the time someone is older, you would expect that they can do more things, right? Or different things. And that at a very basic level shows that literacy can't be a single thing because it changes over time. And so if we think about what it takes to master a particular kind of literacy, right? We have content knowledge, right? We have genre knowledge, we have rhetorical knowledge, we've got technological knowledge, and a whole other bunch of kinds of knowledge beyond just simply, can you mechanically decode the written text? And one way to, as sort of an anecdote to talk about that, right, is if you've ever gone to see like a Pixar movie, right? You brought like a younger sibling, frequently, or any kid's movie, right? There are frequently jokes that are included that, although the kid might be able to decode the words, right? They know what words are being spoken. The meaning of that joke goes over their head. Or for example, so my daughter is really into My Little Pony, and we read the comic books on my tablet. And frequently those comic books will make pop culture references where she can read the comic. She's quite a good reader, but she doesn't get the references, and so she doesn't get the jokes, right? And I have to sort of step in and explain why something is supposed to be funny. It's thunder in the distance. I'm not sure if you can pick that up on the microphone. And so what does it mean to be literate? Well, it can be many things, right? And there are lots of factors that we have to think about. I think a lot about the technological dimension because especially actually because in so many of your first project papers, you talked about all these different kinds of digital communication that you had with these schools, the ways you engage with social media, right? These are technologically based literacies that didn't exist 20 years ago when I was applying to college. Like they had not developed yet. And so in many ways, you are more literate in a variety of kind of social media contexts than probably your professors are, especially if you've ever tried to see your professors do social media. So this is why I'm not on Twitter in a meaningful sense. So again, literacy is multiplicitous, right? There's many kinds of literacies, and it's complex, right? It's not just a single thing. We talked about how literacy has value, right? And in the video where Deborah Brandt is actually talking about her own research, she talks about how literacy is this commodity because literacy never exists for its own sake, right? Literacy always exists because it enables you to gain access to something, right? It's something that you can trade. It's something that can be exchanged. It's something that you can invest in with the hope that there's going to be some kind of payoff. And as she and other authors that we've read this week, including Young and Rue, have noted, some literacies carry more value than others, right? So if we say that literacy carries a value and we say that there are multiple kinds of literacy, it stands to reason that some literacies might carry more value than other literacies, right? Right or wrong. We know that literacy is something that is sponsored, and if it's and again, Brandt talks about sponsors as being these individuals who support our literacy development in a variety of ways, and that can happen in at both the individual level, right? So parents or individual teachers, older siblings can sponsor our literacy. So if we think back to our experiences of reading and writing, we might think about how an older sibling might have read to us. I was the oldest sibling, so I definitely remember reading to my younger siblings. And now that my daughter is 6 and my son is 2, she spends a lot of time reading to him, or at least she reads aloud and he kind of butts in to listen to it, right? But there is some sponsorship going on there. We can talk about sponsorship at the institutional level, right? And that can be, institutional just means anything bigger than a single individual, right? So a religious organization, right? Your church or synagogue could be a sponsor of your literacy. If you ever went to like Sunday school, or you went to a religious private school, right? So like I went to Catholic school and we took religious education as part of that, right? And that was a kind of sponsorship of a kind of literacy. But institutions can also include, right, our actual formal schooling, right? Whether it's religiously affiliated or not. Jobs, right, can sponsor certain kinds of literacies. When I was much younger, maybe even a little bit younger than you, I worked at Sears, and I worked in the electronics department, and the first thing I had to do for the first 2 weeks was basically read nothing but technical manuals to learn the nature of the products that I was going to be selling, so that I could explain them to customers, right? And while I was someone who was always sort of interested in technology, I never sort of got into it in that kind of level, but my knowledge of at least what at that point was like cutting edge technology was rapidly accelerated because my employer had a vested interest in sponsoring my literacy in that particular area because it served their broader institutional needs. We know that our sponsors tend to be more powerful, more entrenched, more knowledgeable, frequently more affluent than ourselves. That makes a lot of sense if you kind of step back, right? Your parents have more money and more power than you do. Your teachers are more entrenched in the kinds of literacy that they are trying to impart in you. They have a greater degree of knowledge, and so that's a component of sponsors. Brandt and others also point out in a way that sponsors are inequitable in distribution, and what that basically means is that not everyone gets access to the same kinds of sponsors, and that some sponsors have more to give in a sense, right? As Brandt points out, right, throughout their lives, affluent people from high caste racial groups have multiple and redundant contexts with powerful literacy sponsors. And this can be anything from being able to pay for a tutor, being able to buy reading materials, being able to have the flexibility and the finances necessary to move, for example, to a better school district, right? If they decide that they're going to have kids and they want to be in a better school district, affluent individuals have the ability to sponsor literacy in that way, and in a way that others with less financial security would not be able to do. Right? So we've learned a bit about sponsors. What have we learned about sponsorship, right? The process by which sponsoring happens. Well, one thing that Brent points out is that sponsorship carries ideological freight. Those who sponsor us are not always doing it just out of the goodness of their hearts, right? They have something to gain. So what do they have to gain? At the parental level, right? Something they have to gain might be simply like being able to brag about how good hey, my daughter's going to Fairfield U, or my son's going to Fairfield U, right? There could be potential financial gain, right? Maybe they're hoping that you can support them in their old age, right? If you think about religious institutions, right, they are trying to sponsor your literacy in such a way that helps to reinforce a certain set of religious values and beliefs. Even your schools, right? If you think about Fairfield University as a potential future sponsor of your literacy, Fairfield as a Jesuit institution carries with it certain values. And in the process of sponsoring your education, right, in the process of guiding you through your education, there is, in theory, a hope that you begin to develop some of those values, even if you don't identify as Catholic or Jesuit, right? But that these broader values of caring for the whole person, being men and women for others, right? These are things that will be cultivated, in theory, through the sponsorship of your literacy, through the core curriculum and your majors. If we look at Cisneros, right, and we think about some of the freight that carries along with it, right, the idea that sponsorship comes with strings attached. The only reason she was able to go to college was that her father felt that by going there, she would be able to meet someone, a man that she could marry, and because this man was going to college, he would likely be able to provide for her in the way that a possible husband who did not have a college degree would not be able to. And so there was this sort of expectation of a value transfer, right? That not only would he send her to college, but that she would use her time there as an opportunity to find a husband, right? Now, as we know from that piece, it went very differently, but there is that sense that sponsorship frequently comes with that sense of strings attached. And it might be for you, right, that your parents expect you to major in a particular major, or they expect you to take a job in a particular location, or they expect that, by sending you to a Catholic college that you will, strengthen your Catholic values, none of which may actually happen, but there might be that expectation there. And with Rue, right, we learned that this idea that sponsorship, particularly institutional sponsorship, can have an impact on the things that we're meant to value. In this case, the kinds of narratives we're supposed to value. And so if you remember the Rue piece, she talks about how one of the main concerns that educators have at the primary grades and older is that as kids learn how to read, how you keep them engaged. And so there's this concern that, well, boys will only read certain kinds of narratives, and so we need to tailor the reading that we support in that direction, with the assumption that girls will be willing to read pretty much anything, whereas boys are going to be really particular. And she argues, right, that the approach to sponsorship in that context has an impact on the way that people begin to develop a sense of what stories are worth listening to, or what stories merit our attention. When we looked at the Young essay, right, he pushes institutional sponsorship a little bit harder and says, frequently institutional sponsorship, right, in the case of our education system, right, both primary, secondary, and higher ed, serves to preserve the status quo for those in power, right? That by choosing to sponsor literacy framed around a single standard English, those who are involved in that process serve to only reinforce conditions that put speakers of non-standard varieties of English at a distinct disadvantage, and even worse, which again we'll touch on momentarily. And then in Tejada, right, Tejada et al., sponsorship is impacted by perceptions of the sponsored, right? So in that instance where these students are sort of talking about their experience, about how their intro level writing classes, right, their quote unquote remedial classes are taught and developed, we learn, and they're sort of shocked to learn, that those who teach these sort of remedial or developmental classes tend to be the least experienced and least well-paid instructors on campus. And that's actually true, right? Like that is actually pretty common, that it can be sometimes difficult at many colleges to get more experienced faculty members to agree to teach remedial or developmental classes. and they can be frequently taught by adjunct faculty who are essentially teaching part-time for an incredibly small salary, and are often stretched thin because they need to teach at multiple locations, multiple colleges at the same time to sort of make ends meet. So because the argument could be here that because those who are being sponsored, right, these students who have done poorly on these placement exams are remedial or less than, that they end up being the institution ends up sponsoring their literacy in a problematic way by assigning them less qualified or less experienced faculty. We also saw in many of our readings a discussion of the ways in which literacy sponsorship can be subverted. Brandt talks about examples, provides sort of the examples of White and Steele, and two women who found ways to, harkening back to chapter 1, right? They found ways to transfer the literacy skills that they were sponsored in by their employers in ways that they can then use those skills in both, in the case of White, her religious life, and Steele in her sort of home life and home budgeting, in ways that help forward their goals, personal goals, right? In ways that their sponsors, right, their work sponsors, would not have anticipated or thought about as they were sponsoring White and Steele's literacy development on the job. In Cisneros, we clearly see an example of subversion, right? She's sent to college to find a husband, right? And she notes that one of the nice things about that was that since her father really didn't care about what her education looked like, as long as she landed a husband, she could major in whatever she wanted. So she majored in what she was passionate about. She never did get a husband from college, and ended up being a well-known author, published several times over. And so she was able to take advantage of the way in which her literacy was sponsored to use it towards her own ends. And in perhaps one of the most interesting examples, right, you have Tejado et al., who were assigned to a developmental, remedial writing class and used that experience to develop a research project calling into question the very nature of that program, right, and to seek sort of reform in that particular arena. So they demonstrate that, although literacy is frequently subject to sponsorship, that sponsorship can also be subverted towards the individual's own ends and goals. We also sort of see an attention towards institutional consequences and the notion of self-fulfilling prophecies, right? So in Roux, we see a cycle, right? We don't want to challenge boys' assumptions about what's interesting to read. Right? So we assume that boys only want to read narratives about other boys or other men, and we don't challenge that assumption, and we don't challenge their assumption. We roll with their assumption because we're afraid of them backing away from reading. So they read more stuff about men, right? And in the process, we never give them the opportunity to discover other kinds of narratives, right? So by not challenging their assumptions, we also never give ourselves an opportunity to challenge the assumptions we're making about what they want to read, right? We can't know whether or not boys would be willing to read other kinds of narratives if we're too afraid to assign those kinds of texts. So we have sort of a self-fulfilling prophecy. We tell them that, this is what you should read, and as a result, they're less likely to read the stuff that made us make these decisions in the first place. For Young, right, the idea of enforcing a single standard just reinforces racist attitudes and practices that are used to justify the insistence on the single standard, right? So Fish says, we need to enforce a single standard, otherwise speakers of non-standard varieties will be subject to racism. And Young is pointing out, the problem is the racism part, not the language part, right? And so by forcing them to sort of codify and ratify this single standard, it just provides further ammunition to those who would use that as a means of discriminating against those groups who use quote-unquote non-standard varieties of written and spoken English. And again, in Tejado et al., we see this in the issue of the self-fulfilling prophecy with the psychology of labels, right? How, while not the case for all of the students who put together that research project, many of them talked about how being labeled remedial, right, severely undercut their confidence and really made them question whether or not they belonged in college. And for some students, that is enough to sort of send them spiraling out of the college system, right? They believe, because they've been labeled remedial, that they're not cut out for college work. They doubt themselves. They begin to disinvest from the work of the class, and in essence, then just prove the point that they weren't college material. And the reality is that has nothing to do with whether or not they're college material, right? But by applying these kinds of labels, we can set students up for failure in ways that we don't necessarily intend. Now let's turn to some open questions about literacy, some that we'll be turning to as we make our way through the next couple of weeks. One of the big questions here is, again, going back to the nature of literacy. Is literacy something that you possess? Or is it something that someone is perceived to possess, right? Are you literate because you have literacy? Or are you literate because those who get to make the call perceive you as having literacy, right? They see you as a literate individual, and therefore you are deemed to be literate. And this is going to be really important as we move into next week and the James Paul G reading on discourse, where he talks about how literacy is often used as a means by which we determine who does and does not belong to our particular groups, right? And we'll dive much more into that early next week. But this is something to kind of toss around in your head, right? Is literacy something that you can just like own? Or is it a quality in those who have been perceived to have it, right? If enough people say that you're literate, does that make you literate? Other open questions that I hope you'll be thinking about. What are the alternatives to single standard models of English language education, right? I think Young makes a pretty compelling case in a number of ways. No variety of English has moral superiority, right? There's simply different ways of communicating, and those ways tend to be internally consistent. And so they're value neutral in that regard, at least. There's no hierarchy of better or worse Englishes. There are simply different kinds of Englishes that function in different kinds of groups. And so if we accept the fact that that model provides advantages to certain populations of, unfair advantages to certain populations of students, are there ways to rethink this model? I had one student who, last year who asked me, like, how you change everything, and my suggestion to him was, next time you find yourself about to sort of judge someone on their language practices, don't, right? If you're in a position of power, you're reading a resume, doing an interview, you might not be able to change, the broader education system, but you can change the way that you respond to the way that other people use English, and that makes a difference too. And another big question that I've been thinking about a lot lately, particularly in this context of COVID and the pandemic, right? Literacy practices continuously change. So how are they going to continue to change, right? What literacies will come to be more valuable in the next 10 years, right? As we've moved into sort of this like period of extreme social distancing, online learning, telecommuting, right, in ways that really have scaled up in unprecedented ways. Will we find new things that determine whether or not someone is literate, right? Or there's certain kinds of literacy practices that are going to take on increasing value as we make our way through. And what's, I think, fun or interesting to me is there will probably be literacy practices that are going to be really important to you in 10 years that don't exist yet, right? If I go back to when I was a college student, at Fairfield U, and this was, I started in 2001, there was no real social media. Only a couple of schools had Facebook. There was no Twitter. There was no YouTube. The idea that social media was something that you did, or no Instagram, right? The idea that was a kind of literacy that not only you could develop, but master to the point of turning it into a career was unheard of, right? These are forms of communication that we didn't anticipate. There was no framework for even citing social media content because it was not a thing. And I guarantee you in 10 years there are going to be things that are not a thing now. So thinking about that, I think, can be a fascinating question as we're looking forward. So I'm going to wrap up the conversation here. Next week we'll be talking about discourses, and I can't wait to jump into it. So hope everyone's doing well, and take care.